let me just say, I imagine just about everybody here knows Bryan, and he doesn't need much introduction in this crowd, but I'll just say a couple words. So Bryan is a professor of political science and humanities at Yale, and he's the chair of the Yale Humanities Program. And he's written quite a few articles and essays and a book called Saving Persuasion, A Defense of Rhetoric and Judgment. And my understanding is that he's now finishing a book entitled The Heart of a Heartless World, which will be on early 19th century liberalism. So I'm guessing the paper today is at least indirectly relevant to that project, although I gather it's not taken directly from it. So, but in any case, if the paper's any indication, the book is going to be well worth reading by all of us. I think we have a great paper to discuss today. And so let me not take up any more time getting to it. So I'll turn it over to Bryan. Thank you for doing this, Bryan.
Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. It's great to see some familiar faces here. Thanks for spending part of your Friday doing this. Thanks, thanks Devin and Jeffrey and everyone else who's involved in setting this up. And I also just wanted to say a brief apology for not attending earlier sessions. I just couldn't make them, but I've watched a few online and have enjoyed them very much. So I'm looking forward to the questions and the conversation. And I'm going to assume that people have looked at the paper, so I won't read any part of it, but we'll just sort of try to explain why I wrote it. It's related to the book project that I've had around for quite some time, but it's not out of the book. Obviously, there are serious questions about the fate of liberal democracies that have come into the public forum in a new way in the last 4 or 5 years, let's say. And I've been asked to be on panels, as some of you probably have, about liberalism. Are you for it? Are you against it? And I've ended up being on the for side, but it feels not quite right to me, because what first drew me into political philosophy, I would say, is the sense that I had discovered a world of writers who had articulated some of the deep anxieties that I had only vaguely felt, and that had, authors like Rousseau, Nietzsche, in a different way, Plato and Aristotle, authors who I found to be somehow pointing out things that I learned liberalism, as ordinarily understood, might be putting in the way of a fulfilling human life. So I feel odd having now found myself on panels defending liberal democracy, and I wanted to think about how the recent wave of criticisms of liberalism intersected with some of the deeper criticisms of liberalism that first drew me to political philosophy and the history of political thought. And I should say that the moment in which I discovered political philosophy, this was the 1990s, and it was arguably the moment of that we should have been most triumphalist about liberal democracy. It was after the fall of the Berlin Wall and after Fukuyama, and even China had turned towards markets. And so at that moment, to be attracted to the doubts about it, well, those doubts are arguably more in front of our eyes today. So that's just in the background, and I'm sure that basic situation is familiar to everyone here. Then there's a kind of writing that I wanted to try, which this paper is not the sort of thing I usually write. That is to say, I really thought of it as thinking along with a particular short text, but not writing a commentary on it. There's very little quotation, as you'll have noticed. It's a few steps removed from Marx's text, at least. And that felt to me like allowing myself maybe more latitude than I was accustomed to. And it was sort of an experiment. And I'm sure I've opened myself up in all sorts of ways, which I'm about to hear. But I just point that out just as a text. It was a sort of writing that I had wanted to try and I learned a lot from, I will say that. Something about forcing myself to try to state the fundamental problems that I felt the text was helping me to think about at a greater remove from the language of the text itself. I felt that was worthwhile. So I'll just mention that, another preliminary point. As far as substance, maybe I'll just highlight, as I reread the paper today, I think what I was really thinking through was the implication of Tocqueville's observation that Marx points to. That is, the observation that religion flourished in the United States, that is, in a setting in which religion had been disestablished, in a setting in which the separation of church and state was complete. Now, in a way, the flourishing of religion in those conditions was a central liberal idea. That is, that religion could flourish in those conditions. You can find in not only American liberal thinkers, but also French liberals like Benjamin Constant, who I've spent some time thinking about. But for Marx, this posed a real question, a puzzle, I think, almost, because if you think, as he did, of religion as a form of unfreedom, then you think of disestablishment as a form of liberation. You're freeing people. And therefore, to watch people, in a way, choose to be subjected to religion is troubling, is a puzzle that requires further thought. Why does that happen? Why does that happen? And yet, what I've described as liberalism here, the separation of church and state, and so on, seems to presume and to hope for this state of affairs. And as you've seen in the paper, I just sort of approach that problem from different angles and see what I can make of it. Because the truth is, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that there's something deeply incoherent about the stance of liberal states towards religion, that we seem to want to free people from religion understood as something that can constrain them, and yet we don't go the whole way in doing that. We let them remain mired in it. Well, why is that? What understanding of religion must we have to make sense of that as a goal? And what understanding of politics or of the state must we have to make sense of that as a political program? Or the alternative is that liberalism is a fundamentally ambiguous state of affairs. It's one that's best understood as a halfway house on the way towards a more complete liberation of one kind or another. Now, when I state the matter that way, I rebel. I think I'm a champion of liberalism, and it seems to me that there's a form of consciousness that flourishes under it that's valuable, but I don't think that liberals have often articulated what the value of that form of consciousness is in a way that is strong and robust enough to stand up to the kinds of questions that have come up here. Let me bring out just one other way of getting at the same problem from the paper that I guess I came across in writing the paper that seems maybe just to restate the problem, but it seemed interesting to me at the time, and that is that the liberal representative states can seem torn between two goals, which I described as, on the one hand, wanting to represent the people, that is, as they're found in society, and on the other hand, wanting to reform that society, that is, to liberate us as individuals from the social worlds that can constrain us. And at different moments, our regimes seem to want to do one or the other of those two things, to reform society so as to further liberate us from the social forms of unfreedom, or to simply represent society um, as it exists. And I was struck thinking in this mode that if a liberal state was fully successful in either of those tasks, it would no longer seem to be liberal. And I wasn't sure what to make of that fact, whether that's a fatal flaw or whether that's a characteristic that should be embraced or celebrated, or whether it's not a fair description at all. But I'll just say I was struck by that fact. So I like your thoughts about that. And then I'll say, just as my last word of introduction here, that the very closing of the paper is not satisfactory. That is, I return to the thought from volume 1 of Tocqueville's Democracy in America, the hope that society itself could be understood not as something we needed to be liberated from, that there could be such a thing as a democratic social state, and therefore that the relation between state and society wouldn't be thrown into the dilemma that I've just been trying to describe. But, and I can see what Tocqueville was getting at, that individuals liberated from the historic religions and property relations and other social facts which came to seem oppressive, that those individuals could then construct a society, a set of social bonds that was enough to support them as social beings. And yet they would not feel the need to be liberated from. But so that's the thought that I go back to. But it clearly wasn't persuasive to Marx. And as much as I liked Tocqueville and love studying him and refer to him, I'm not sure the thought alone is well, it didn't remain persuasive to Tocqueville later on. And I'm not sure it's sufficient to meet some of the dilemmas that have arisen earlier in the paper. So I'm also really interested in your thoughts about if you accept that there's anything to those dilemmas, about whether there's anything to the Tocquevillian thought, or whether there's some other direction in which it would be more fruitful to go and thinking our way out of those dilemmas. So let me stop there, because I think the Q&A will be most engaging.
Okay, thanks a lot, Bryan. So as I said before, I think it's probably best if we just use the raised hand function. So if you have a question, just I assume everybody knows how to do that. Although I'm not sure that I do, but I assume everybody else does. And it doesn't matter in my case. So if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. If not, I have a couple and I'll get things started, but I don't want to jump out first if somebody else. Ben, you're
Yes.
raising your literal hand. I meant your figurative.
Right.
You can raise your literal hand as well.
Okay,
So
thank you. Like you, I can't find my metaphorical hand.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about what seems to me to be a tension between perhaps two notions of liberation. That is to say, liberation in Marx and then liberation in political liberalism. It seems to me, and they're incompatible, and it seems to me that Marx is the wrong guide. It seems to me that Marx's conception of liberation is based ultimately on a metaphysics of reconciliation, of wholeness, completeness, and the end of the dialectic. Whereas I think we've learned from our experience with liberalism that liberation in a liberal democracy is very different from a liberation from a disease, for example, which we overcome, or maybe even different from a liberation from something like cultural support for slavery. Because it seems to me that at any given time, a core aspect of liberation in the sense of political liberalism is tolerance for difference. And those differences inevitably will include much that someone and many people will find revolting, disgusting, unacceptable. And therefore, a liberal society is one that is always fraught with turmoil. And then liberation under those circumstances can't possibly seek a Marxian reconciliation, but rather perhaps some form of managing this turmoil, and perhaps identifying certain opinions that are simply intolerable, but always allowing for many opinions that some people will find intolerable.
Yeah, so I knew the quality was going to be high here. Thank you. I do think, I mean, I agree that Marx's understanding of liberation, or in this essay, emancipation, human emancipation, as he calls it, is, well, it's too simple in a sense for liberalism. And I'm very sympathetic with the kind of language he used, that liberalism is always a kind of messy tumult. And so the question, though, that I'm interested in is, how do you live a fulfilled life in that tumult, a life that you think of as free? It seems to be the case that the emphasis that liberal regimes put on us as individuals plays a role. That is, we're meant to think of ourselves as having a fundamental ethical existence outside of the social entity, outside of our church, our family, and other forms of our social existence, I guess you would say. And so that separation in itself, is it constitutive of our freedom or happiness, or is it necessary to it? I mean, liberalism does seem to put some weight on that separation, just in prioritizing us as individuals in the sense of who's represented. I mean, we vote as individuals alone in the voting booth. We leave that social world behind and pull the curtain. And so that moment, let's call it, of liberation from society, I mean, that much we do share with Marx, I think. And so that's what I was putting the weight on. Now, ultimately, of course, in Marx's thought, I mean, society becomes something different, and we're not separate. We have this species being, but that's not society full of the inequalities. Societies, we've got it, in fact. So I think it's that shared moment that I was trying to think through.
Okay, Alan Fumarescu.
Yeah, hi, Brian. Long
Hi.
time no see. Good to see you.
It's great to see you.
So thank you for your paper. It was really interesting, and it made me think, and it made me go back to something that I wrote like 10 years ago in my first paper, when I tackled a little bit about Marx and the Jewish question. And I was thinking, one phrase in your paper says, and I'm quoting now, "We say the liberal state represents individuals, but what precisely are individuals?" And I was thinking that there are two clues here in this phrase. One is liberal state, and the other one is what are precisely the individuals? And why am I saying this is because, first of all, if we start off with the premise of this is a liberal society and a liberal state, as you put it repeatedly, we are kind of placing our thoughts in one box that imposes a certain vision about what civil society stands for and what association stands for and different belonging stands for, which is not a must. Because, I mean, if you look at your neighbors, they won't think, oh, I'm right now part of the civil society or of a liberal society or anything like that. So why constrain our thoughts by wording the problem this way? That would be my first. It's not a question. It's a question, commentary, whatever. And the second one would be, what is, this is, I think, is the crux of the matter. What precisely is the individual? Because when I wrote in my first book a long time ago about Marx and the Jewish question, he says all civil society had a directly political character. And he was right and wrong at the same time. Why he was right? Because indeed, all these intermediate associations, all of these different belongings, I'm a Christian, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Jew, I'm a whatever, homosexual or not, whatever. All of these were parts of the entire body politic, because it was this organic vision of the political body. So from this perspective, he was right that the whole civil society was political, but he was wrong also when he assumed that there was no distinction between the, the, the private sphere and the public sphere during the Middle Ages. That's a common mistake that people think about. Well, in the Middle Ages, everyone defined himself or herself based upon belongings to different communities or universities, right? But that's only one side of the story. The other side of the story is the individual did not perceive them, the individuals did not perceive themselves as being one-dimensional. They were two-dimensional. And I don't want to brag about my own research, but the forum internum and forum externum. So the individual has a double dimension, an inner self and an outer self. The outer self was defined indeed by belonging to different corporations, universities, communities, or whatever. But you also have an inner self, which was a self of uniqueness, authenticity, and whatnot. And therefore, the split between the public and the private did not start with the modern civil society. There was a split between, or not a split, let me rephrase this, a dialectic, a distinction, but a dialectical distinction between the private and the public, but that starts inside of the individual, not outside of him. So what we understand today by civil society and what Marx understood by civil society would be more like the bridge between the public sphere and the private sphere. And obviously this Marx wanted to collapse the two, right? Destroy the bridge. The personal is the political. You can cross the bridge two ways. You can cross the bridge by making the personal political, or bring the politic in your bedroom, or you can make the other way around, thinking about politics in economics terms. In civil society, the abstract individuals, selfish individuals, and impose this vision upon politics. Both options being, I think, wrong. So to summarize, and I apologize for talking so long, but I think the problem is you are onto really something big, but it's a matter of rephrasing and rethinking a little bit out of the box of what liberal means, why society has to be liberal, and why we think about civil society the way we think. It's not a must.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I've been making some notes. So I think at the moment, two thoughts occur to me. One, on the idea of a liberal society, I think it's very helpful to leave that to one side. Because I think even the characteristics that one might attribute to such a society, I mean, you might say people have kind of been raised into habits of toleration and pluralism, I suppose, and things like that. But I'm more tempted by the view that people live in social worlds, and there's a constant liberalism as a set of attitudes, liberality, toleration, require constant work on how we live in our social worlds, and in some ways act against tendencies that we tend to fall into, maybe because of their sustaining of social life. So that's all just to say that a static state of affairs called liberal society seems to me misleading, and that I'm not sure how much that overlaps with your reasons for being suspicious of it, but I think there is overlap. And then on the second part of what you were saying about individuals and civil society having a political character, here I was really struck by the way Marx uses the word state. I mean, it's the state is a certain institution for him through which we act on ourselves in civil society in certain ways. And he thought well, I mentioned the part of the essay on the Jacobins. Marx thought that the Jacobins' downfall really was inevitable because of their strategy, that because they were using the state to essentially try to get rid of the state in his view. There was something fundamentally self-contradictory about that strategy. And so when I think when he speaks of having a political character, society having a political character, by political he means its relationship to the state. And there, I am sure that there's a lot of caricature in his understanding of, his sort of adoption of Hegel's understanding of the medieval world and how that relates to the state. But I'm struck that we still think of states partly in the way that Marx described, that is, as the instrument by which individuals can free themselves from certain forms of domination in society. And I would say that we see this expectation of the state in the US very clearly now. You can talk about the civil rights legislation as an example of it, not to mention going back to slavery. So again, I mean, I'm not a Marx scholar. I wouldn't, it's not that I think he's the best guide to all of these topics, but here I'm just focusing on what seem to be parts of his argument that do have power for us, even if the rest of his thought doesn't seem good. And here I think more than focusing on society, it's the state. It's the idea of a state as something separable, at least conceptually, from society and working on it, that I think we have imbibed to some extent, and that helps generate some of the dilemmas that I was describing in the paper.
Maybe I'll take this opportunity
on the fact that Marx, it's really useful to force us to think differently about the state. But that's the challenge, but it's also part of the problem as well.
Okay.
I'm stopping here.
Maybe I'll take this chance to jump in a bit, and it's, I think, related to both of the last two questions, what I wanted to ask about. And Bryan, you may disagree just with the premise of my question, because the premise of my question is what seemed to me to be a difference between you and Marx in the way you set up the dilemma. Especially when you, near the end, where you lay out what seems to me the most important dilemma, this tension between the representative impulse of liberalism and the reformist impulse of liberalism. And it seems to me that's a very good way of thinking about this constant instability. And it also, was a good lens through which to think of our own political conflicts between left and right. But what struck me as the potential difference between you and Marx is that you suggest that both of those impulses are intrinsic to liberalism. And therefore, it's a dilemma that liberalism just inevitably lives because it has this built-in tension between these two impulses. But it seemed to me, though, that Marx's complaint is that the reformist impulse is not in other words, it seems to me, I'm not sure, Marx might say the problem with liberalism is that it's only one of those two things. And so it seems to me that Marx would say that the reformist impulse is at best very, very, very partial in liberalism. Now it's complicated because on the Jewish question, he doesn't even use exactly the word liberalism, but let's assume that by political emancipation, we can say he means liberalism. But it seems to me that he would say that the problem with liberalism is not that tension, but the problem with liberalism is that it's on the wrong side of that tension. So I guess my question is that a genuine difference between the way you cast the issue and the way he does? And if it is, does that make an important difference?
Yeah, that's really helpful. And well, it seems right to me that yes, of course. I mean, why not go all the way with a reform? That's the complaint in one sense. And yet there's a way in which the argument unfolds that makes me think that he did think of liberalism or political emancipation as a halfway house, because it does admit the need for some emancipation. I mean, that is, it's not content to leave us in the old regime, to put it that way. And now I'm about to really deal in caricature, but it's not content to leave us in our corporatist social entities, determined by them. Political emancipation sees the need of emancipating us, and the state is brought into being as a political force powerful enough to combat those old regime social forces, on behalf of a kind of freedom. So there's something reformist already in that. Now it doesn't bring about human emancipation, but I think for him, I mean, I think he suggests that you've already gone part of the way. Now it's true, the way I've put it is, I think, more sympathetic to that halfway position. I mean, I'm trying to be. And so the way I've put it emphasizes this as a kind of constitutive tension that we would have to reconcile ourselves to if we wanted a convincing defense of this state of affairs, that nevertheless acknowledged the truth in what Marx was saying. I mean, that's my tendency of thought here, is to try to acknowledge as much of the truth of Marx's worries as possible, no, as much as seems fair, as much as is true about the liberal situation, in order to then be able to say that there may be reasons why the state of affairs he assumes is a not attractive one might actually be attractive in different ways. So I would want to say that the back and forth between reform and representation, those two moments or impulses, is generative of certain goods for us, ethically and politically and socially. And that's the argument I haven't really made here. And that would be certainly different from the direction Marx is going. But I do think that the suggestion that I don't think his understanding of liberalism is merely the reflection of existing social organization in a political structure. That would be sort of a corporatist kind of representation.
But what struck me where you went further, though, I that makes sense to me. But what you had a very striking formulation on page 11, where you raised the question whether liberal societies derive their whole reason from being from the desire to eliminate the prior resources. In other words, which just seems to me the most extreme formulation you have in the whole paper of this reformist impulse within liberalism.
Right.
And it seems to me that Marx would, I mean, he obviously wants to eliminate those resources, no doubt about it. He's sympathetic to the project, but it seems to me that he wouldn't say that that's the reason for liberal societies. In fact, he would say that that's the limitation of liberal societies is that they hold back too much from that. So it seemed that seemed to be a moment where you were presenting liberalism as more transformative than Marx takes it to be.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I'm not sure on I'm not sure on Marx's own view. But what you've revealed is that I really do think of liberalism as a post-revolutionary phenomenon. In France, and the word is used that way, and their struggle really was to find a stable middle ground that accepted the revolution, but didn't go in the direction Marx was suggesting. And but not only there, in England and in the US too, I think England's a little harder on the revolution question. But I think of liberalism as a post-revolutionary state of affairs, and in that case, well, it's a revolution, and that's a serious reformist moment. And there's no effort to go back on that from liberals, I don't think. So that's where that was coming from.
Okay, let Susan, who's that? Susan Shell? Susan Shell is the S there.
Hi, Susan. Oh, you're muted.
You're muted, Susan.
Yeah,
There
sorry.
you go.
So I apologize. There's so many people here. I was going to say nothing, give everyone else a chance, but since nobody's raising their hand and I just figured out how to do it, I will. Well, so you know vastly more about the French liberals than I do. I mainly know Constant as the guy that prompted Kant to write his most ridiculous piece of writing ever about, you know, you can't lie to a murderer, and so at the door. But that said, I'm just want to push back, or at least wonder a little bit about your use of the term liberal here, because if you mean the French liberals, and mostly the early 19th century French liberals, that seems to be perfectly legitimate. But it doesn't seem to me that broadly speaking, and I'm not just talking about liberals versus conservatives in the immediate contemporary context, but when I use liberal in a kind of sloppy way, I'm kind of thinking liberal democracy. I'm thinking the United States, which is a pre-revolutionary phenomenon in part, 1776 versus 1789. I'm thinking Locke, I'm thinking Montesquieu, I'm thinking Kant, I'm thinking the Germans who take a slightly different path. And so I'm just wondering to what extent your analysis is limited by your focus on the French, especially vis-a-vis Marx, because well, he may have been interested in them, but surely he was interested in Kant and especially Hegel, who have a very different way of analyzing the relationship between civil society and the state. And that it might be interesting to therefore to compare the two. The French, who seem to be much more, from my uninformed view, obsessed with the problem of central government coming out of monarchy and revolution being on the one hand an overturning of the monarchy and at the other a kind of reinstatement of it. Whereas for the Germans, the centralized state through Friedrich is much more geared toward, it's a kind of modernizing institution over against the aristocracy. So for the French, aristocracy seems to be, out of Montesquieu, a kind of force of freedom vis-a-vis the monarchy. It seems to me that they come at it from very different places. And therefore, the German tradition is more inclined, at least the liberal side, to see the central government as as the state as a liberating, having a liberating function. On the other hand, in the American context, given that we did have slavery for so long, just as when Kant is writing, the Germans still have serfdom, it seems only natural in a way that we would look to the state, or some people would, to liberate people from a civil society that is not yet truly liberal. So I'm just wondering whether there isn't a limitation in focusing so much on Constant and the French and Tocqueville, as opposed to other thinkers who inform the liberal tradition broadly understood. And one thing that stands out is, to my mind, coming out of Locke, the degree to which the liberal tradition in this broader sense is focused on expanding prosperity. And that's something that you really don't talk about, is the economy. I mean, in other words, the property thing isn't just some sort of static, it's landed aristocracy versus equality. It's let's liberate property so it can make more goodies for everybody. And that was the summit. In other words, it seems to be a much more complicated picture than your analysis allows for. So I guess I was just asking you to why focus so intensely on the French liberal tradition, if what you're trying to understand is America today.
Yeah, it's a great question, Susan. And so on the property part, I mean, you're completely right. And I think I say, I'm just not, I just didn't go into that in this paper. So I have to think more about that. And I do think the questions are not just analogous to the ones that have come up in thinking through religion. There is reason to think about the French, because when you read the essay, there aren't many proper names that come up in it. And those that do, he quotes and cites what Rousseau and Tocqueville, and talks about the Jacobin episode. So I do think I think the French example was in mind, and I think the United States, through the lens of Tocqueville, was in mind for him. And I think what you said, I mean, I'm weak on the German case, so I have to defer to you, but the way you described it, the state understood as a modernizing force against the aristocracy. I mean, that fits with the pattern that's come out in the reading that I'm giving, where the state, I mean, if by modernizing you mean partly liberating, I mean, the part that I do think I need to say something about and probably think a little bit about is, I mean, the Hegelian understanding of a representative government that is more corporatist in a sense, that has a reflection of society in it, even as it also somehow does justice to us as individuals. That has a different mechanism and a different structure than the way I was describing individuals being kind of liberated from their social conditions. So that part I think I need to go back to and figure out.
Thank you.
Rafe, it's you. You're up.
Is it not a line?
You're at the there. You're at the front of it.
Hey, Bryan, thanks for the presentation. The papers, I think both are great. I just want to maybe put the emphasis on the other foot and kind of maybe suggest that maybe human beings are halfway houses, just by nature. I have this quote I like from the Tocqueville. I'll just read. It's just one line. I think this is the point at which he's talking about the silly laws for kissing and long hair, etc. He says, such lapses doubtless bring shame on the human mind. They attest to the inferiority of our nature, which, incapable of firmly grasping the true and the just, is most often reduced to choosing between two excesses. And by that, I mean, I just mean it looks like Tocqueville thinks that human beings are not capable of being free. Sorry, most often not capable of being free. So is the halfway house character of liberalism something imposed, or is it something that's adapted to human nature? So let me, one more way of saying the same thing. So we want people to be free, but we want to reform them before they're free. There's like we expect a certain type of person that's capable of being free, etc. Right? We want to represent people capable of being free, and we want to reform people not capable of being free. But it looks like Tocqueville thinks that actually most often people just aren't capable of being free.
That's interesting, that formulation. Of course, he's famous for having thought he spotted in the US habits of freedom that were kind of reinforced by our practices. But what I find especially interesting in what you're saying is, look, I've been struck for a long time by, well, and this paper partly came out of one passing observation from Pierre Manon, and he has in different ways asked the question of whether human nature is such that we can flourish in modern liberal settings. And the first part of what you were saying suggests one way of answering that question affirmatively, which is that if liberalism often seems to be wishy-washy or requiring us to oscillate between different commitments, or to keep a part of ourselves in reserve from any one full commitment, that may be a familiar quality of human nature, and maybe even one that we would not want to run away from. And that's I find that an interesting thought, that would be a part of a certain kind of defense of our lives in these liberal societies.
The floor is open right now. Sue Collins.
Bryan, thank you for the paper and for this conversation. So I'm still puzzling over, maybe I just want you to say a little bit more about what the goods would be that would come out of what your understand, well, not come out of your understanding, but come out of the movement back and forth, the tension between the liberal state's representative function and its reformist ambitions, which I understand your presentation of that reformist ambition as a reform towards greater and greater individual emancipation and maybe individual agency, though I'm not sure I'm understanding. That would be sort of a second question. But I wonder if you'd say more about something that you mentioned in your response to Devin, but didn't say much about in the paper itself.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think you're right about the sense of individual agency, I suppose, as what the reformist impulse means. And as far as what good might come out of the oscillation back and forth, you know, that's something that in my other work, I've tried to articulate in different ways. I mean, you know, it seems to me that if we think about our relationship to what I've been describing as our social world, but let me say more concretely, to our families, our geographical communities, our towns, our churches or synagogues or religions, organizations we're a part of, and all that. I mean, it seems reasonable to me to think that the healthiest form of human life might involve a kind of dance back and forth between reassuring ourselves that we are not only constituted by our membership in those groups, and yet reassuring ourselves that we are not fully alienated from them, that we depend on them in various ways. So, you know, it's not a very deep answer, but on the other hand, and following up, I think what Rafe might, or how I heard the way this question might have pointed, I could see developing a sense of what a full, desirable human life is in a way that made the negotiation of that problem a feature of that life, and that if one didn't feel it as a problem, one would lose touch with, you know, important components of the good life. So that's the sort of thing that comes to mind. I mean, as I'm saying that, I'm so conscious of the fact that I guess I started graduate school and was formed by this communitarianism, liberalism debate, and maybe I'm still just working that out, although I hope it's something more than that.
If I could just,
Yeah, go ahead, Sue. Go ahead.
I just wanted to follow up a little bit. I wonder whether or not you aren't reproducing the dilemma, which you state fairly early in the paper, which is that on the one hand, we seek to be free, by which we mean emancipated from various forms of authority, excuse me. But on the other hand, we choose to be unfree, so that we seek in a way to, it's partly what I think you mean by choosing forms of relations which are substantial, so that we choose in a way our own bondage, and we do that in a free manner, in a voluntary manner, but we also accept the ties that bind, which make us unfree. But so I wonder if the notion of social existence, which comes out on the last page, let me see if I can just, this was part of what I was puzzling over when I was reading the last page, where you write, understanding how individuals liberated from traditional social authorities can construct new forms of spiritual experience and social being together that are both substantial enough to orient lives. That's a question of what you mean by substantial enough to orient lives, and compatible with the individual freedoms the liberal state protects. That's also a puzzle of the paper: protects, but doesn't shape, doesn't act as an obstacle of, doesn't deform, remains a crucial task for anyone trying to see clearly the possibilities for liberal society today. So, I mean, you left me with a deep puzzle in that regard, I guess I would put it. And I wondered whether or not you weren't sort of recreating the very dilemma that the liberal state itself poses for you, and perhaps simply, and whether or not that's a coherent aim or purpose in the end, for individuals who are sort of have the ambition that you're speaking of.
Yeah, I think I probably am recreating or just really restating the dilemma in a different way. I mean, that's my worry about the paper, is it seems to me to just sort of dwell on a problem and not find traction on it. But I think taking the problem seriously is already rejecting certain proposed solutions to it that are out there. For example, you might think, well, the answer is to make sure that we have a moment of choice, that we can fully endorse from an autonomous individual position of choice, whatever commitments we have to our family or church. And so long as you have that, you should be fully reconciled to whatever apparent constraints on your freedom those social entanglements impose. But that seems too simple to me, both politically and psychologically and ethically. That is, I don't think there's a moment of wholly open choice outside those commitments. And then I also think that even the ones that one can think of oneself as having chosen can still seem like constraints later on, and can in fact be constraints. And so there's some more active way of thinking about ourselves as both individuals and members that would have to itself be a part of the ongoing activity of a good life in order for this way of living to be choice-worthy on its own. That is, for the way of living that the apparent dilemmas of the liberal state um, enmesh us in. I mean, the question is, does negotiating these problems, being pulled between private and public to different communities and the freedom from them, there's something that's just dissatisfying to many people about that. That's frustrating. And I think you can see in many of the anti-liberal movements of different kinds, forms of this frustration. And one answer is, well, at least it keeps us closer to peace. It keeps us from tearing each other apart, and we just have to live with the frustrations. But I'd love if there were a stronger answer that we could give, a more satisfying answer to why dealing with those challenges is itself ennobling and worthwhile as a part of a human life.
Okay, Shalini.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm gonna try to be super quick because there's construction outside my window. So, Brian, I really enjoyed the paper, and I was just wondering. I'm also just looking at the very last passage that Susan Collins was just looking at, and I and I'm linking it back to something you said in your opening remarks, where you said that you were hoping that we could articulate the form of consciousness that flourishes or could flourish under liberalism in a more robust way. And, I was just, this is just an invitation for you to elaborate the Robert Frost quote in terms of that consciousness that you think we might want to articulate in a more robust way. I'm really interested in this idea of being attached to fences that you refer to in passing. And then just is in a way, it's almost like is this better articulation of the liberal consciousness one in which you're actually trying to put a positive spin on the constitutive tensions of liberalism, like that constitutive tension, rather than being a problem, is precisely the kind of consciousness that liberalism gives us as a gift in some way. And in some ways, liberalism has generated out of itself something to substitute for one of its presuppositions. And so these are just a couple of questions I had.
No, that's great. That's and that is the direction of my thinking, is to want to try to articulate yes, some of the positive aspects of what are often seen as debilitating tensions within liberalism. I think that has to be, that I don't see another path towards a strong defense of liberalism, because unlike other liberals out there anyway, I feel that there's real power and truth in these descriptions of these tensions within liberalism. And yeah, I think it's a very demanding form of political and social organization psychologically. And I think that we have to be able to explain to ourselves and to others why it's worth it to make these efforts, what the ethical life that it enables is. That's the direction I'd like to go, and I've been trying to go. I think Susan mentioned Benjamin Constant, and I've written a fair amount on him, and to my surprise, I've written a fair amount on him. He's not a particularly admirable figure in my view, actually, but I think at moments he was trying to work on that same problem. He was trying to figure out if there was an answer to that question. On the Frost, I believe I read from the editor of the complete edition of his poems that he himself put these two poems into dialogue in his mind, and that the Tuft the Flowers line, the idea that men work together, whether they work together or apart, was meant as an answer to the good fences make good neighbors of the of Mending Wall. I mean, the attachment to fences is there's nothing very sophisticated going on there. It's this sense of a kind of naive liberal individualism, maybe libertarian, good New England libertarian and sentiment. But the realization in the later poem that even when one is supposedly working apart, when one thinks of oneself as an individual, one's of course enmeshed in a social world. And I don't mean to just repeat the kind of ordinary fact that we are more reliant than we realize on other people, although that's true, but that our consciousness as individuals has to somehow encompass that reliance, and yet not conceive of that as a concession. So something in those lines at the moment just seemed, again, just to restate this problem, it's not a solution. You can't cite two lines from a poet as a solution, but I found it revelatory for a moment, so I put it in there.
Ellen and then Dana.
Yes, sorry for the follow-up, but after hearing all of the discussions, I'm still a little bit confused. Once again, let me reiterate, I think you are onto something big and you seized a huge problem. But I think once again that the way we are formulating the problem might be a part of the problem. Because, for example, both you and Susan talked about like the ties that we want to untie ourselves in order to be free. What exactly does that mean? I mean, we are used to talk words that is like, okay, I want to be unfree from being short-sighted or from being a male. Is that a tie that I want to untie in order to be some sort of a free spirit floating in the whatever? You got my point. So I think the problem is about how we formulate this. And the problem comes back to the individual. Is not about reforming society or reforming the state or the political realm or anything like that. It's about how do we think about ourselves. Speaking of representation, it's how we represent ourselves to begin with, because the problem of political representation might be a problem of self-representation. And one more thing, and I'm stopping now. What are these unsolvable tensions a problem? Let me rephrase this even strongest words. Why having a problem is a problem that we want to solve? You end up with a phrase from Frost, which is a paradox, right? It's not either or. You can be, it's not either politics or society. It's not either the state or it's not public or private. You can be both at the same time. If the physicians agree that the photon can be at the same time a wave and the particle, why can't we do the same thing?
Well, that may be the answer. And, I mean, that may be the sort of answer that I'm headed for. I think it is, but I am interested in, I think it just is the fact that we keep using that, yeah, but these liberal societies are challenging for many people, but that to embrace the paradox in the way that you just described, it's a more complicated thought, and people are in those societies, especially when the societies are new, but not only then, are often drawn to simpler modes of being, and those modes of being may not actually exist as real options in the world, but the idea of them seems powerful to people. And I want to do I'm a kind of like, I think that's a real political force. And I think we see it in different ways. So I'm not denying actually what you're saying so much as trying to go more slowly and work my way towards that, and do justice to the sense that people have. For example, at the beginning of your comments, for example, it's certainly true that there's a kind of naive, overly abstract idea of freedom and of the individual. As you say, can we be free of our, I don't know what you say, hair color, eye color, parentage? No, but I don't know, I have a teenager at the moment, and it is a natural human propensity to push against certainly the social world that has formed you, and that has, now I feel like I'm just giving up too much. There's a natural human impulse there, and I don't think it's sufficient to base a politics on, but I think it creates real political phenomena. So even though we might say, well, that's a oversimple, naive understanding of freedom, that doesn't mean it doesn't have political force, and it doesn't mean that the dissatisfaction with accounts of freedom that are more complicated doesn't cause us real problems, and therefore that we need an answer to it.
Dana.
I wanted to ask about your use of Tocqueville in the paper, and just something that puzzled me a little bit about it, especially in light of the conversation today, which is just that when in thinking about these various parts of life and liberalism that constrain us and that we need to be liberated from, Tocqueville wouldn't say that religion was one of those things, right? So doesn't he take a much more positive view of religion and its role in life? And isn't he trying to sort of figure out how it can be propped up in the modern era? And so I guess in general, doesn't it it seems to matter a lot that there's a big question as to whether that's something that it is going to be beneficial to people to be liberated from.
Oh, yes.
Difference.
No, I agree. And that's why, although it may have faded away, but at the beginning of the paper anyway, I was very careful to say, like, Marx thought that religion is a form of unfreedom. And I tried to put some distance between myself and that thought. And in Tocqueville, I have a certain reading of him on religion, which is that, of course, he's very friendly to it, and we all know the passages in which he says that it's necessary and sustaining, especially in a democracy. But he also describes its transformation in America. That is the sort of religion that does not have to be overcome, is not a threat to freedom in this society, has already made accommodations, or you could say has already been reformed, and that's why we don't need to free ourselves from it. And it's so when he's talking about Puritanism, there's this congregational structure, which means that it's already sort of allowed an ambiguity as to where the final authority is. Is it in God, or is it in the community that's kind of giving the religious laws their legal character? And then later on, after the separation, he writes about the way that priests interact with politics in a way that shows them really being very differential, never going against the main thrust of even the materialistic. They kind of moderate a little bit the materialism of America, but they don't really contest it and try to undo it. And even Catholicism, as you know, in his account, is what he emphasizes about it is the equality of us all beneath God or the priest, and that's the moment of reconciliation there. So I think that it's that kind of internal process of reform he feels has sort of, it's not been imposed by the state, and it doesn't have to be imposed by the state in his view. That's part of the miracle of why the United States seems to offer a different path than what both sides of the French debates have thought they had to choose between. But it's not, I think, for him, because no reform is necessary. It's because there was a process by which the religion reformed enough by itself to fit into this new structure.
Okay, I have another question, but I'll let Louis get in first.
Thanks. Yeah, I just had kind of a specific micro level question about a particular paragraph, if that's all right.
Sure.
On page 24, you talk about the Weimar Republic and its weakness in the face of the Nazi threat. And you say, Weimar's weakness in the face of that threat remains a deep fear about the coherence and strength of liberalism. If the failure arose from an internal dynamic within liberalism, it's not one that can be counterbalanced or overcome by a subsequent victory over external enemies. So I was just curious if you could elaborate on how the weakness of the Weimar Republic indicates some failure of, or raises some doubts about the coherence of liberalism. I see the point about weakness and strength, but what internal dynamic were you pointing to there? Because it seems to me that someone could say, well, the ideal liberal regime, I don't know about the Weimar Republic, but the ideal liberal regime could protect maybe not groups as groups, but the individuals within those groups in a way their group membership would be presupposed, or the group would be presupposed, as would its religiosity, but the individuals and their rights would be protected ideally. So I'm just curious about that question about liberalism's ability to protect groups in general, or or what theoretical difficulty you were pointing to there.
Yeah, I didn't. I'm looking at the line now. I think I was thinking just that the weakness might be due to an incoherence. I mean, I know that's what I was thinking as I wrote the sentence, so maybe I should just strike the coherence, because the worry is, first of all, I certainly don't know that Weimar is a good test case for liberalism in general, and I try to indicate that that's, but it's been thought of, or the failure has been thought of as a failure of liberalism. So, so I want to think that through. And then the question is it an incidental failure? That is, it's just a failure of a regime, and the regime happened to be liberal, but the failure is not attributable to any of the concerns that we've been looking at in the paper. Or is there a possibility that that's not the case? Is there a possibility that the weakness of the regime was precisely the fact that it generated discontents because of the kinds of dilemmas, or of the dilemma really, that the paper's about, and those discontents explain what went wrong. That's what the thought is meant to be anyway, that these apparent tensions or the apparent incoherence of liberalism generate real frustrations that take political form. I mean, I'm very interested in what you all on the call make of that thought. That, I mean, is it the case that the frustrations that liberalism generates because of its basic structure are linked to either this failure in Weimar, or to populisms of today, or to, yeah, well, to those two things?
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, so are you saying it might actually be a kind of theoretical failing if liberalism gives rise to so much discontent of a certain type that it can't achieve its own aims?
It'd be something to be aware of. Yeah.
Let me jump in then for a second before Alex asks his question, because it's related to this last point, because I think I would answer your question that I do suspect my answer would be yes, that some of the discontent is due to these dilemmas. But I want to link it with the earlier discussion of your quote unquote solution at the end. And just, I want to sort of separate the question from the intrinsic merits of that solution to the likelihood of the world moving in that direction, because it seems to me one might well grant that it's a good solution in principle, but the prospects seem dim. And let me just say why. It seems to me what you suggest in that solution is that there's a kind of impressive, in a way happy life to be lived in the middle of liberalism, and a soul that lives the tension between liberation and reconnection. But it doesn't seem, but on the political level, that doesn't seem to be what we're seeing. You know, that kind of middle ground seems to be getting hollowed out, and instead we're getting an ever fiercer, ever more hatred between the one impulse and the other impulse. And so it seems to be the middle is disappearing. And then psychologically, there seems to be an awful lot of discontent. And you've suggested a number of times that it's a difficult, psychologically difficult position to hold, to live that middle ground. And I wonder, just as a sort of predictive matter, whether it's not asking too much to think that that's going to become, not that some people there might not be impressive, mature liberals in the world, but that as a doctrine, it asks too much for people to live in that middle ground. And so there's a tendency, therefore, to veer to one of the two extremes because they're simpler and at least seem to be more simply satisfying.
Yeah, well, that's my worry. I think you stated it. Of course, the great hope of a certain kind of American liberal is that kind of a certain condition of material plenty and geographical isolation combined with one example of this liberalism could could provide an example of how it can work out, and that example itself can lead other people to try to find their way towards something similar. That was the sort of exemplary understanding of you could say American exceptionalism. It doesn't look like it's working out so well at the moment, but it's hard to tell if that's the moment or if that's the direction for good that we're going in. And it's hard to tell also which problems have to do with these kinds of, philosophical problems that we like to think about, and which problems have to do with ways we've fallen away in practice from those ideas, or just a certain level of material inequality, which makes it hard to live out, what you described, I was trying to describe. But I am worried that you might be right.
All right, Alex, you're up.
Oh, that's great. Thanks. Bryan, I just wanted to thank you for your paper, which was a really beautiful meditation. Your language of thinking with reminds me of a teacher I had in graduate school who would combine both rigor, but also a kind of gentle procession carefully, which it reminded me of that, and I loved reading it. So thank you. My question is about, I want to ask, you gestured a few times at the illiberalism of our present moment, or the various illiberalisms that are stalking the world. And I wanted to ask you to expand on that. And I have in mind, I'll start from this, that you draw this ambiguity we've touched on a few times between the liberal state as representative and the liberal state as reforming. And I think I understand what both liberal and illiberal forms of that reforming impulse include. Reform, not to say purification, the creation of an individual stripped of, or let's say liberated from, all the presuppositions that Marx gestures at and that you refer to: religion, social, whether that be class, or even different forms of our background, property qualifications, economic limitations. Even you could think sex and gender as non-chosen features of life or limitations on our freedom. So a liberal or illiberal future that includes individuals of such a character. But what would it mean to have could there be such a liberal state that hit pause or hit stop on that trajectory that was simply representative of the way that things are now, where we've gotten so far? Would that be anything other than a kind of status quoism, or is there such a thing as an illiberalism of the right that can seize a liberal state and use it? It doesn't sound liberal at that point. It sounds fascist if you're just going to try and hit pause and defend the existing corporate structures of society. National Socialism aspired to more than that, and it really looks more like a kind of an atavistic futurism, where some mythical features of the past guide the reforming impulses. I guess I'm asking you to fill in the right wing of this picture, and you would have to speculate. It's not, your paper gestures at it, but any thoughts you had, I'd appreciate. Something other than status quoism, does that exist, or are we just temporizing with this unavoidable future?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I do think there's a way in which, sorry, let me think. There's one place in the paper in which I describe a constant intensification or furtherance that can develop it when you focus on the question of whether your choice as an individual is really free, and you see all the ways in which you're in fact constrained, limited by your social situation. And the more you focus on that, I suggested, the more constraints you'll see. And even when you liberate yourself from some, you'll discover others. And, you know, one way of talking about the movement of history or time that you were referring to in your question is that we are not likely to discover a steady state in which we feel we've gotten the, you know, we've gotten free enough choice as individuals, and we've got attachment enough of the sort we want in society, and we can just freeze it. And it may be that, so this is a kind of problem that I don't know how to solve, and I'd also be interested in thoughts. That is, there's a way in which we can come to think of ourselves as constantly chasing the presupposition, I shouldn't use that word because I used it differently, constantly chasing the preconditions of what liberal democracy would require citizens to be. That is, yes, as soon as we free individuals enough from these forms of tyranny, we'll be in good shape, and then we can run with a regular form of liberal democracy with a kind of weaker reforming element. But until we get there, we've got to let the state wield a stronger hammer to get us to the point where we can really be free and equal citizens and dealing with one another as that theory demands. But the problem is, will we ever get there? Or will it always seem just out of reach because aspects of social life that had earlier seemed not oppressive come to seem that way? That's a dynamic that I think exists. And now the way I've described it is a little different than talking about the status quoism, but I think it's a way of trying to understand the dynamic behind your question.
Thank you.
Devin, you're muted.
Evan, you're muted.
Devin, you're muted.
Sorry, you guys didn't hear my joke.
Oh.
Thank God.
I was saying that I once called Zarko in public and got chastised and told his name was Professor Minkoff by him. So Zarko, you're up.
That's what is this? You're making it up, and it's probably too late to ask this. I don't know if you discussed technology already, and because the most obvious sign of the weakness of Marxism, and I guess you're not discussing Marxism only, is that the individual dies, and you talk about it on page 8, but then you quickly move to representative government, and I never thought representative government could solve the problem of death, because it's too bureaucratic a thing, and so you might say that that's the ultimate constraint. And Marx doesn't mention that very much. And when he does mention it, the response he gives is surprising, because you think that he would say, eventually we're going to conquer it, so nobody will die, just with the use of technology. We're going to have a kind of androgynous, fully developed being that doesn't die. And instead he says, it doesn't matter because the individual is just one thing. The important thing is that just repeats again and again, but the important thing is the species being. But what role does technology play in your consideration here of liberation or full representation?
No, I haven't thought enough about that. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that technology obviously changes the set of possibilities that we imagine in terms of what choices are available to us in terms of who we live with, in terms of our own characteristics or our children's characteristics. Technology is constantly expanding the apparent realm of human choice. And if that choice, if we conceive of freedom partly as a matter of having choices, obviously technology holds in front of us the promise of more and more choice. Now, I mean, I think it's a false promise, but politically, again, the power of dangling that in front of us is real, and it may make it more difficult for us to reconcile ourselves to the given, to what we inherit, to what we don't choose. So that's one thing that comes to mind in any case, and I think that would tend to enhance rather than quiet the dilemma that I've been trying to think about.
Okay.
Don't you have to show that it's not possible to achieve this technological solution? I mean, you're just saying it seems implausible, but you have to, I mean, what if you could, for example, achieve immortality, technological immortality? That was kind of the starting point of your idea of individuality. I mean, I know on page 8 that's what does it mean to be an individual? You die alone. I don't know exactly alone, but I mean, in the sense that not exactly sure what it means.
I mean, as soon as we cross that threshold, I think I have to see the field. I haven't yet thought my way into the world of immortal beings.
Okay, well, we're past 3:30, so we need to leave it here. So everybody, please join me in thanking Bryan. I think this is a terrific hour and a half. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. Thanks so much for great questions.